Attached, you find a simple starting project, basically a pretty empty React application with an empty app component. And once you download it and extracted the attached file, you just need to run npm install to install all dependencies, like the React library. And thereafter, once you ran npm install, which I already did here, you run npm start to start this application. And you'll be greeted by such an empty screen because currently there's nothing inside of app.js, nothing inside of our app component. Now, in the application which you saw in the last lecture, I want to have a couple of different areas, a couple of different components. We had that component where we could enter our name and our age. We had that error modal, that error overlay component. We had a button to submit this and to confirm that we saw the error in that error modal. And we of course also had that list of users. Therefore, I'll start by roughly planning out the components we'll have. And for that, I'll add a new components folder in which I want to store those components. And I'll add a UI folder for general UI components which we'll have, like the button. And in components, I'll also add a second folder, and that will be my users folder for all the user-related components. And now in there, we can start adding component files, and I'll start with that component that allows us to add a new user. Hence here in the users folder, I'll add a new AddUser.js file, which should hold the logic for us to add a new user. Now in there, I want to have a React component. So of course we have to import React from React, as you learned, because we're going to use some JSX code here. I'll then add my AddUser component using this function syntax, which we can use in JavaScript, an arrow function stored in a constant. Of course, as I mentioned before, you can also add a function like this. Nothing wrong with that, but I'll go for this approach. And I'll export this as my default so that we can import that component, that function, into another file and use it there. Now, inside of AddUser, I, in the end, want to render something on the screen which allows the user to enter a name and an age and have a button to confirm all of that. Therefore, in here, I will add a form, let's say, and inside of that form, I want to have a label where I say username, and of course, that should all be returned, so let's wrap it into brackets and then put a return statement in front of it. So there, I want to have a label, and I want to have an input, where the user then is actually able to type that username. And that input will be of type text because I, well, expect some text there. Now for accessibility, we can also add an ID here, username. And then on the label, we would add the for attribute normally. Now for, just like class, is not a name that is available in JSX because these would be reserved JavaScript names. And therefore, it's HTML4 actually. That's the prop name for assigning that for attribute to a label. And with that, we connect it to that input. And that's important for screen readers and so on, so that they understand which label belongs to which input. So we got that. Now I also need another pair of label and input for the age in years, let's say. And here the type will be number because I expect to get a number here. Something like 31, 18, 25, and so on. Now I'll name this age, I'll give it an ID of age, and therefore the HTML4 prop here also has a value of age. And with that I got these two inputs. Now below those I want to have a button of type submit, which will basically submit that form. And here I have add user as my text. So that's a straightforward form. Now on the form here, I'll add the onSubmit prop to specify a function that should be executed when that form is submitted. And therefore here, I will actually add a new function inside of the AddUser component function. And that's the, let's say, AddUser handler function. Now here I expect to get my event object, and I will call event prevent default to prevent that default, which for the submission event is that a request is sent. I don't want that default, hence I prevent it here. And now we can connect onSubmit here to AddUserHandler by passing AddUserHandler like this to onSubmit. Important, as I explained before, don't add parentheses here. This would immediately execute AddUserHandler when this line is parsed. Instead, I just want to pass a pointer to that function to the onSubmit prop so that the form component internally can use that function when it needs to use it, i.e. when that form is getting submitted. So with that, we got this AddUserHandler here. Now let's go over to app.js and let's import it here. So I import AddUser from ./components/users/AddUser. And here in the div, we can then add AddUser like that. That's how we can add this component here. And if we now save that and go back, we should see this relatively ugly but working component. I can click Add User and the page is not reloading, which proves that this form submission is effectively handled and the default is prevented. So that's the start. Now, some styling would be nice because that doesn't really look the way I want it to look. Now I'll start in index CSS. There you got some basic styling. I'll go to the HTML element here and add a background styling of 1F, 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 like this, and this will give us a nice dark grayish background. Now I also want to wrap this username and age into a card, you could say, into a container with rounded corners and with a white background. And that's therefore something we'll build in the next lecture. Of course, feel free to try this on your own, build such a wrapping container, maybe already with the right styles on your own, and in the next lecture, we'll build it together.